They claimed the trial would be just, but the moment she stepped inside the courthouse just clinging to her hem, with no one walking beside her, it was obvious to all that justice had packed up and left long before. That day, the saloon emptied earlier than usual. Even the gamblers abandoned their tables, lured by the stench of scandal and the promise of a public spectacle. A murder trial was enough to draw a crowd, but it wasn't the crime that intrigued them. It was the defendant, a servant girl, poor, silent, and utterly alone. It wasn't about what she'd done, but about who she wasn't. She had no husband to vouch for her, no father to stand in her defense. In truth, she didn't even have a name most people remembered. They referred to her simply as the girl from the mayor's house, or the quiet one with those unblinking eyes. She had served in the home of Mayor Elwood Thatcher, a man known as much for his wealth as for his ruthlessness. And now he was dead poisoned, they said, and she had been the only person in the room when he took his last breath. She didn't shed a tear when they hauled her out of that grand house in shackles. She didn't beg, didn't shout, didn't even claim her innocence. Eyes downcast, steps steady, she bore the insults and spittle thrown her way without a word. Now, she sat on a bench near an old rusted stove, hands folded in her lap, hair drawn back into a tight bun that exposed the fading bruises beneath her jawline. The prosecutor paced the floor like a preacher mid-sermon, his voice rising like fire and brimstone as he waved a tiny vial before the jury. This, he declared, is belladonna, the devil's herb. Just a drop can end a man's life as he sleeps. And that's exactly what she did. The crowd hissed, murmured, nodded in agreement. No one bothered to ask why the bottle had been discovered in the mayor's own drawer. No one pointed out that he'd been ailing for months before that final night. And no one questioned what possible benefit a servant girl, who didn't even own a proper pair of shoes, could gain by murdering the only man who gave her a paycheck. The judge, an old companion of the late mayor, observed with the cool detachment of someone torn between duty and friendship but leaning heavily toward the latter. Her court-appointed lawyer had barely spoken all morning. After dabbing sweat from his brow and clearing his throat, he finally rose to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began weakly, "I don't believe there's any actual proof." "That's enough," the judge cut in sharply. "You may sit." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. "She didn't," the girl whispered. Her eyes swept the room, not in search of sympathy, but simply observing how easily people slipped into cruelty when they had no stake in kindness. An elderly baker's wife turned her face away. The stable boy, who once offered her shy grins, now looked anywhere but at her. And the sheriff, who had once discreetly asked if she needed protection from the mayor, now stood rigid at the door like he was guarding a convicted criminal. The jury never retired to deliberate. They didn't see the need. Every person in that room had already written their version of events, and none of those stories left room for mercy. The gavel came down with a crack, and the judge announced a recess before sentencing. The girl was escorted down a back corridor. She didn't fight it. Meanwhile, across town, tucked in the dim corners of a near-empty saloon, a man with dust-gray shoulders and a revolver, resting heavily on his hip, sat in silence, staring at a drink he hadn't touched. He'd been sitting there since dawn, and when the sound of the gavel echoed through the wooden streets of Hollow Rock, he rose to his feet. They called it justice, but it felt more like a stage performance. When the trial resumed after a short recess, the townspeople filtered back into the courtroom, now more energized than before. Some fluttered paper fans, others nibbled on snacks like they were attending a show at the Opera House in Abilene. But this performance had no orchestra, only the quiet dismantling of a life few had cared to notice until now. She was brought back into the room, her chains rattling like storm-tossed wine chimes. Her face, drained of color, revealed nothing. She didn't utter a word. She hadn't since the moment they arrested her. The prosecutor stepped forward again, stoking the flames with fresh fervor. He spun a tale of a bitter servant girl, tolerated only out of the mayor's supposed Christian charity. He described her as secretive, sullen, full of envy, a woman who always listened but rarely spoke. She didn't even shed a tear when the mayor died in her arms, he said, his voice rising for effect. From the back of the room, someone muttered, "A guilty one." Still, no one asked how a woman earning just $2 a week could have managed to purchase a deadly poison. No one questioned why Mayor Thatcher's will had been hastily amended, just a week before his death, disinheriting his estranged sons and leaving everything to an unnamed beneficiary. Her court-appointed attorney, a man who clearly valued his standing in the town more than justice itself, said nothing. When he finally did speak, his words came out soft, awkward, tinged with embarrassment, like he was apologizing for her existence rather than defending it. "There's no direct evidence," the defense murmured. barely loud enough for anyone to hear. Perhaps we should consider. It might have been an accident. A heart condition, maybe? Enough, Mr. Blackwell, the judge interrupted, his voice curt. We've heard all the guessing we need. The girl didn't react. She'd long since made peace with silence. When she was 8, her mother died giving birth to a baby that never took a breath. By the time she turned 12, her father had drowned himself in a bottle. From then on, life taught her how to fade, walk softly, speak rarely, smile only when necessary. She'd served in 5 different homes before winding up in Mayor Thatcher's grand estate, each household harsher than the last. And Thatcher was no exception. His kindness was laced with venom, cloaked in politeness. He never called her by name, just girl, year after year. His hands would pause where they shouldn't linger. He once slapped her across the face for breaking a porcelain teacup, only to hand her extra wages the next day, claiming it was compensation for her troubles. In private, he was a threat. In public, a paragon of respectability. That made her the liar. She'd thought of running once, but to where? Who would take her in? What man in this town would believe a poor servant girl over the revered Mayor Elwood Thatcher? None of it mattered anymore. The judge cleared his throat and scanned the courtroom, with weary eyes, the kind that belonged to a man longing for supper and sleep. Unless there are any last-minute witnesses. He trailed off. The room froze. The air thickened. The heavy doors moaned on their hinges. But no one stepped forward. Not yet. The judge gave a resigned nod. Then this court finds the defendant. He didn't get to finish. The doors burst open with a bang. A figure stumbled inside, breathless and frantic. It was the town stable boy. His hat was gone, his shirt clung to him with sweat, and his chest heaved as if he'd run straight through the heat of the day to get there. He stumbled into the room, breath ragged, something clutched tightly in his hand. I found this, he cried out, raising a wrinkled piece of paper. It's from the mayor. I found it in his desk hidden behind the drawer lining. A wave of gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge motioned sharply for the bailiff, who hurried over, snatched the letter, and brought it forward. The room fell into a tense silence. The judge read the contents silently, his expression hard to read. Then, with deliberate calm, he folded the letter, set it gently on the bench, and looked toward the jury. It changes nothing, he said flatly. The letter is unsigned and unverified. We move forward. Just like that, any flicker of hope vanished into the still air. The girl didn't raise her eyes. She had learned long ago that truth wasn't welcome in every place, and this courtroom was one of them. As dusk draped itself over Hollow Rock, the courthouse slowly emptied. The trial had been adjourned for the evening, but nobody expected tomorrow to bring surprises. The girl, still without a name in the minds of most, would be found guilty, sentenced, and left behind in memory as quickly as she'd been dragged into it. She was led back to a narrow, damp cell tucked behind the sheriff's office. The cot reeked of mildew. The walls were cold, unforgiving stone, and the only glimpse of the outside world came from a thin slit of a window, too high to see anything but a slice of fading sky. Still, she sat upright, back straight, hands folded calmly in her lap. No visitors came. No one brought her food. Even the sheriff, who once tipped his hat to her on the street, avoided meeting her eyes now. His young deputy, red-haired and clearly new to the job, kept watch from a cautious distance, studying her like she was a wild creature that might strike if given the chance. But she didn't lash out. She didn't speak. She simply waited. And in town, life went on. People filled their plates, exchanged gossip, and forgot she ever existed. In the saloon, amid clinking glasses and bursts of laughter, the townsfolk repeated the prosecutor's words as if they were gospel. Over at the church, prayers were whispered for justice, but whether those prayers leaned toward punishment or mercy, no one seemed entirely sure. Back at the Thatcher estate, the mayor's sons had gathered to speak not of their father, but of inheritance and what was now theirs to divide. No one had spoken for her, not the housemaid who had once noticed the bruises, not the cook who'd overheard raised voices behind closed doors, not the doctor who had quietly treated Thatcher's weakening heart and chose to remain silent when summoned for testimony. No one. They all convinced themselves they had too much at stake: their positions, their reputations, the comfort that came from blending in. In Hollow Rock, silence earned more safety than truth ever did. But the girl had nothing left, nothing to protect, nothing left to fear losing. So she waited in that dim cell, still and quiet. As memories crawled through her mind, nights she'd gone to sleep hungry while the mayor feasted with guests. Mornings spent scrubbing floors until her knees ached, only to be scolded for missing a corner. Moments when footsteps behind her made her freeze, heart hammering, afraid to look over her shoulder. She knew this town would forget any kindness she'd ever shown. It would only remember the accusation, whispered in hushed tones and passed like wildfire. Then, just before the clock struck midnight, the door to the sheriff's office creaked open. Footsteps echoed slow, heavy, intentional. The young deputy jumped to his feet, hand hovering over his holster. A man stepped inside. Dust clung to his long coat. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face. A revolver rested low and easy at his side. "Can I help you?" the deputy asked, his voice uneven, cracking under tension. The man didn't respond. He walked straight to the cell and stopped a few feet away. The girl finally looked up. Her eyes sharpened, recognition flickering for a heartbeat then gone. He gave a slight nod, tipping his hat. "Evenin'," he said, voice rough as gravel soaked in old whiskey. "Didn't think I'd find you behind iron." She didn't answer. "I came for answers," the man said, his voice low and steady. "But it seems I might have come for something more." The deputy swallowed hard, clearing his throat. "Sir, visiting hours are." The stranger turned his head slowly, and the deputy fell silent mid-sentence, frozen by the weight of that glance. The silence settled again, thick and heavy. Finally, the stranger looked back at the girl and spoke in a quieter tone. "I'll be at the saloon in the morning. If you want out of this, I suggest you wait." With that, he turned and walked out, the door swinging behind him. She didn't sleep that night, not from fear, but from the strange stillness that came when someone stepped willingly into your silence and didn't turn away. For the first time in forever, someone hadn't looked through her, but at her. By dawn, whispers drifted through hollow rock like fog rolling over the hills. "He's back," muttered the bartender, polishing the same glass again and again. "Didn't think I'd ever lay eyes on that bastard again," he added. "Who?" asked the piano player, his fingers hovering midair above the keys. The bartender leaned in, dropping his voice to a hush. "Cole Maddox." The name sent a cold ripple through the saloon's walls. Cole Maddox wasn't just a man. He was a legend spoken of in low voices and with uneasy glances. Mothers used to warn their sons about him, especially the ones dreaming of joining posses or chasing bounties. Once the fastest draw west of the Black Hills, Cole Maddox had worn many titles: bounty hunter, loner, shadow, ghost. Years ago, he vanished. Some swore he'd died. Others claimed he'd gone mad. A few told tales of him riding straight into a storm, swallowed by wind and lightning like he'd never been real to begin with. But now he was here, again. He sat in the corner of the saloon, shadowed by his wide-brimmed hat, nursing a single cold cup of coffee. He hadn't touched it in hours. The townsfolk gave him space. Even the sheriff, when passing through, chose to keep walking, ignoring the worn revolver at Cole's side and the way his gaze seemed to scan the room without ever shifting. No one approached him. No one dared except for the old man at the piano. The old pianist shuffled toward the corner of the saloon, his steps hesitant, hands trembling just enough to betray his nerves. "You here for her?" he asked, voice barely more than a whisper. Cole didn't look up. "I'm here because I owe a debt." The pianist nodded, though the meaning escaped him. "Folks say she did it." "Folks say plenty," Cole replied, calm and steady. "She hasn't said a single word to defend herself." "That's because no one's ever listened," Cole said, his tone carrying a quiet weight. "When she did speak, it never mattered." The old man glanced around, wary of who might be listening this time. "You planning to speak for her?" Cole finally looked up. His eyes were icy and sharp, focused and unwavering. "I plan to remind this town what it cost when it forgot who it once was." Meanwhile, back at the sheriff's office, the girl stood by the narrow barred window, arms folded across her chest. No one had told her anything about the stranger from the night before, but she remembered his voice, the gravel in it, the stillness, and something else, something deeper, a faint familiarity, like the echo of a life she could have known if the world had been kinder. A name drifted through her mind, not his, not yet, but one she had overheard long ago, muffled through the walls of Mayor Thatcher's study. "Cole Maddox is a necessary evil," she recalled the mayor saying gruffly. "Kills without stealing, protects, but his price is blood." That name had stuck in the corners of her thoughts ever since. Cole Maddox, a man Thatcher had once hired to intimidate a rival, a man who had vanished after a single violent night no one in town dared to remember aloud, a man who now, impossibly, had returned and was waiting, not far from the courthouse. The town's tailor quietly flipped the sign on his door to closed. At the bakery, the owner burned a tray of morning bread, distracted by the sight outside his window. Stranger in a long dark coat walking steadily toward the square. At the saloon, the bartender poured another drink, his hand unsteady and pale. The town had already decided she was guilty, long before a jury was seated or a verdict announced. But now, a name they'd long buried had returned, and it brought its own reckoning. Though the sun climbed steadily overhead, Hollow Rock moved with caution. Its usual midday rhythm slowed to an uneasy crawl. The saloon, which should have been buzzing with laughter and clinking glasses, sat under a hush so deep it felt unnatural. The only sound came from the swinging doors, creaking each time someone peeked in, caught a glimpse of the man in the corner, and quietly backed out. Cole Maddox hadn't moved since daybreak. He remained in the far booth, his hat pulled low over his brow, hands resting on the table not far, but not quite touching the revolver at his side. He hadn't asked for another drink, hadn't spoken, hadn't eaten. He simply waited. The piano stayed silent. The bartender continued polishing glasses that had already been cleaned a dozen times. Occasionally, someone braved the threshold, drawn by curiosity or foolish courage, only to freeze at the sight of Maddox. A few whispered his name, only to be hushed by others who remembered what he had done and what he could still do. By noon, the sheriff stepped through the saloon doors. He walked with forced calm, shoulders stiff under the weight of his badge, trying to wear the law like it still meant something. "Maddox," he greeted with a stiff nod. Cole didn't reply. "You just passing through?" No answer. The sheriff cleared his throat. "Uneasy? We don't want trouble." "Then stop causing it," Cole said, voice low and flat. The sheriff shifted his stance. "If this is about the girl." "It is. She got a fair trial." Cole's eyes finally lifted, cold and cutting. "There ain't a thing fair about this town, least of all that courtroom." The sheriff opened his mouth, then thought better of whatever he was going to say. He wasn't a cruel man, just tired. Tired of compromises, of looking away when it was easier than standing up. And Cole Maddox was not a ghost you argued with. "I'm not here to break your law," Cole said, voice slow, each word like steel drawn from a sheath. "I'm here to remind it." The sheriff gave a single nod, then turned and left, tension clinging to his boots like dust. Back in her cell, the girl sat on the cot with her head bowed. Through the cracks in the walls, she could hear whispers, the kind laced with fear. They spoke his name like a warning, like a prayer. She remembered how Thatcher used to speak of Cole Maddox, with the wary respect one gives to a loaded gun. She remembered a night years ago she'd asked too many questions, and Thatcher exploded in fury. Cole had been in the room, quiet, watching. After that night, the shouting stopped for a while. Then one morning, Cole was just gone, and now he was back. The town didn't know how to react. He was too dangerous to provoke, too unpredictable to trust, and too silent to dismiss. He didn't bark orders or make threats. He didn't need to. His stillness unsettled people. Even the air seemed to lean away from him. At precisely 1 p.m., the courthouse bell rang, sharp and echoing. The saloon doors burst open. Everyone turned. Cole Maddox stood. Every eye tracked him as he walked toward the door, boots whispering across the floorboards, spurs barely making a sound. He paused just before exiting, turned to face the room. "Today, you'll watch a woman hang for something she didn't do," he said, and not one of you lifted a hand. No one replied. He didn't wait for one. He stepped outside, and behind him, a silence deeper than gunfire settled over Hollow Rock. At the courthouse, the pews filled early. Men removed their hats. Women clutched shawls tighter around their shoulders. Children, dragged along by morbid curiosity, were shushed and told to pay attention. The trial had ended the day before. All that remained was the sentencing, a final, formal seal on a decision the town had already made. The judge sat high on his bench, robes immaculate, voice practiced. A dusty Bible rested beside him, mostly for show. Everyone knew it hadn't been opened in years. The jury had delivered its guilty verdict just before supper the previous night. Now, the townsfolk packed the courthouse to witness what they believed would be the last chapter in a tragic, if quiet, tale. The girl was led in, still bound in chains, still silent. She wore the same plain dress she'd been arrested in. It hung loosely now, her shoulders thinner, her eyes darker from nights without rest. She looked less like a criminal and more like a memory struggling to take shape, a shadow of someone who had once dared to hope. She was told to stand. She did. "You have any final words?" the judge asked, more out of obligation than compassion. She shook her head. And so the judge began his sentence, an ornate, weighty speech filled with legal jargon and hollow scripture, draped in solemnity as if dressing injustice in church clothes could make it holy. Then the door creaked open. The sound cut through the chamber like a blade. All eyes turned. Bootsteps followed, measured, heavy, echoing off the floorboards like thunder rolling in slow. Cole Maddox stepped into the room. The judge faltered mid-sentence. The sheriff stood halfway, then thought better and sat. The girl didn't turn. She didn't need to. She felt him. She knew. Cole walked directly down the center aisle. No one dared stop him. No one whispered his name. He reached the front and stood behind her. The judge, voice strained, tried to recover. This court finds the defendant guilty. She's my wife, Cole said. The words struck the room like a hammer to glass. Gasps scattered through the air. A child whimpered. Someone near the back muttered, "That can't be right." The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "What did you say?" "I said," Cole repeated calmly, "she's my wife." "You're interrupting a legal proceeding," the judge snapped. "I'm correcting it. This is a courtroom," the judge barked, "not some saloon for tall tales." "Then let the truth speak," Cole replied. He reached slowly into his coat, movements deliberate, and pulled out a folded document. "Marriage license, filed in Dis Creek 2 years ago." The sheriff, pale and sweating, stepped forward to take it. He read it once, then again. His eyes moved to the girl. She didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't cry. She only blinked. The judge scoffed. "Even if this is legitimate, which I doubt, it has no bearing on her guilt." "It has everything to do with why she was alone," Cole replied. "Why no one stood by her." He turned, gaze sweeping the crowd. "Because none of you knew. Because she didn't tell you. Because she knew you wouldn't listen." The courtroom fell still. No one met his eyes. The judge banged his gavel, the sound brittle. "This is highly irregular." Cole stepped closer to the girl and spoke softly. "You're not alone anymore." For the first time during the entire trial, her hands trembled. Not from fear, not quite from relief, but from something that had cracked in the stillness inside her, not broken, just opened. The gavel sat idle now, crooked on the judge's bench. The sheriff held the license like it might burn through his fingers, and the jurors, so quick in their judgment yesterday, now stared at her as if truly seeing her for the first time. Her silence had changed. No longer the silence of abandonment. Now it was the silence of someone who had a shield. The judge tried to gather authority again. "Even if this marriage is valid, it doesn't absolve her of murder. This is a matter of justice, not sentiment." Cole took one step forward. "I'm not here for sentiment," he said. "I'm here because you lied. All of you." A murmur spread through the room like wind across dry leaves. "She asked for help before the mayor died," Cole said, voice even. "I was there. I heard her. I saw the bruises. I watched him work her half dead through fever, injury. I left because I thought the law would do what I couldn't. But it didn't." He looked at the room, his voice sharpening. "You all watched. You all whispered. And now you claim justice." The judge's face flushed deep red. "You're not an officer of this court. You have no standing here." "I don't need authority," Cole answered. "I have the truth." He turned to the sheriff. "You remember the cut on her lip. You saw it. You asked if she wanted to press charges." The sheriff swallowed, then nodded. "Barely." "She said no," he murmured. "Said it would only make things worse." "She was right," Cole said, "because it did." The judge opened his mouth to object again, but Cole's voice came first. "I didn't come to save her. I came to remind you what you buried." From his coat, he produced another paper, a worn medical report signed by the town doctor. He handed it over. "Bruises, a broken rib, internal bleeding. A year ago." Gasps filled the room again. The paper passed from hand to hand until it reached the judge. He read it silently. "She wasn't lashing out," Cole said. "She was surviving." Then he turned, not to the judge, not to the crowd, to her. "You wanted to disappear so bad, you forgot you mattered." She lifted her gaze, eyes meeting his. "I left," he continued, "because I thought it was better to disappear than stay and burn it all down. But I was wrong." The room held its breath. No one moved. No one dared. And at last, she spoke. One word, low and steady. "Cole." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a plea. It was recognition. It was the beginning of something none of them had prepared for. She said no. He murmured. "Said it would only make things worse." "She was right," Cole said, "because it did." The judge opened his mouth to object again, but Cole's voice came first. "I didn't come to save her. I came to remind you what you buried." From his coat, he produced another paper, a worn medical report signed by the town doctor. He handed it over. "Bruises, a broken rib, internal bleeding. A year ago." Gasps filled the room again. The paper passed from hand to hand until it reached the judge. He read it silently. "She wasn't lashing out," Cole said. "She was surviving." Then he turned, not to the judge, not to the crowd, to her. "You wanted to disappear so bad, you forgot you mattered." She lifted her gaze, eyes meeting his. "I left," he continued, "because I thought it was better to disappear than stay and burn it all down. But I was wrong." The room held its breath. No one moved. No one dared. And at last, she spoke. One word, low and steady. "Cole." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a plea. It was recognition. It was the beginning of something none of them had prepared for. A voice rose from the back of the courtroom, thin, shaky, but unmistakably human. "I saw Mayor Granger strike her," said Mrs. Hensley, the baker's wife. Heads turned. She trembled, her hands clutching the edge of a pew. He used to make her kneel while he drank. Tears ran down her cheeks as silence turned into murmurs. Then came Maria, the old housemaid. She cleaned his room when she had a fever. I begged him to let her rest. He just laughed. Mr. Rives, the hunched piano player, stood next. I saw bruises on her arms. That was 2 years ago. I said nothing. I thought it wasn't my place. The room stirred. Guilt had finally found a voice. Judge Roland leaned back in his chair, the gavel untouched. The truth was heavier than any sentence he had prepared. Cole Maddox didn't speak again. He didn't have to. The crowd began to thin, filing out of the courthouse one by one. No verdict was given that day. No sentence declared. The judge stood slowly, robe hanging like dead weight on his shoulders. There will be a recess, he announced, voice unsteady, to review new evidence and witness testimonies. The girl Emery was led back to her cell, but this time, her wrists were unshackled. The deputy escorting her kept his head down. His hands trembled as he opened the iron door. Emery asked no questions. She simply sat, quietly. Across town, Cole stood at the edge of Hollow Rock's dusty square, silent, unmoving. He didn't go to the saloon, didn't search for food or shelter. He waited. People passed. Some glanced, unsure whether to thank him. Others pretended not to see him at all. By nightfall, Dr. Calvin arrived at the sheriff's office, a worn file in hand and shame carved into his expression. I lied, he confessed, by omission. I treated her multiple times, never filed it. I feared the mayor more than I feared God. Sheriff Ellery's voice came quiet. You're not the only one. The next morning, Hollow Rock felt altered. No declarations, no posters, but something had shifted. Cole Maddox's name, once a whisper of fear, now carried a different weight. Not as a gunman, not as a wanted man, but something far more threatening. A mirror, one that forced the town to see what they'd tried to ignore. Cole sat on a bench outside the jail, hat low over his eyes. People passed again. This time, they whispered his name with discomfort, not because of what he might do, but because of what he already knew. Inside, Emery sat alone, but her thoughts roamed restlessly. She remembered the first time she'd heard Cole Maddox's name spoken by Mayor Granger himself during a drunken argument. I'll bring Maddox back if you don't shut your mouth, he had growled. Back then, the staff spoke of Cole like legend, a hired gun but with rules. Dangerous, yes, but fair. And unlike most men, he never looked at her like she was invisible. Then he vanished. Now, he was back claiming to be her husband. She didn't understand it, didn't even know if it was true, but somewhere deep within her, the part of her that still wanted to believe there was hope, that maybe someone had seen her before the courtroom did. Outside, Sheriff Ellery approached. The judge is reopening the case, he said. New testimonies, witnesses. Cole didn't look up. Too little, too late. Maybe, the sheriff nodded, but maybe not for her. He paused. You really marry her? Cole gave a shrug. Does it matter? It does to some of us. Cole stood slowly. Let the town do what it needs. But when this ends, she walks free. And you? I'll be gone by then. The sheriff didn't argue, just nodded. Cole turned to leave, but a voice called out behind him. She deserves more than freedom. He turned to see the piano man standing in the square, hunched and frail but eyes clear. She deserves a place, a name, something that lasts longer than shame. Cole tipped his hat. Then maybe it's time Hollow Rock remembers who it used to be. The church bell rang that evening, not by order, but by will. The courthouse had lost the town's faith. The church now stood in its place. People came. No official announcement, no legal notice, but they came. Not for blood, not for justice carved in stone. They came because they had seen something unexpected, truth that didn't scream, didn't demand. It simply stood, bruised and silent, and dared them to look. The pews filled slowly. Mrs. Hensley, the housemaid, the cook, the piano man, the stable boy, each taking a seat, silently declaring, we were wrong. Cole Maddox stood in the back, arms folded, watching. Emery entered beside the sheriff. No chains, no bowed head. Her steps were hesitant, but her spine was straight. And then finally she spoke. I didn't kill him, she said, voice soft but strong. I wanted to, many times, but I didn't. She looked around, not in anger but in sorrow. I begged. I prayed. I stayed silent because I thought it would keep me safe. She turned to Judge Roland, now seated like any man, robes discarded. It didn't. One by one, the townsfolk stood. Maria spoke of the mayor's rages. The cook recalled nights Emery went without food. The stable boy described what he saw behind the barn. Even the judge, ashen with guilt, confessed that he had heard the rumors, but never asked. By dusk, There was no need for a formal verdict. The truth had already spoken, not with fury, but with quiet faith. In Hollow Rock, redemption returned not with gunfire, but with grace. The sun dipped low behind the ridge as Jonah Maddox stood at the edge of Hollow Rock, horse saddled, coat slung over one shoulder. Behind him, the town faded to silence. Ahead, nothing but open road. That's where she found him. I don't remember marrying you, she said. You didn't, Jonah replied. She blinked. The papers were real, but I never filed them. Her eyes narrowed. Then why bring them? Because they'd believe me before they'd believe you. She studied him, trying to read the man who had spoken for her when no one else had. So, you lied for me. No, Jonah said simply. I lied with you. A breeze stirred the hem of her dress. The world felt unfamiliar and certain, but somehow safe. You can stay, he added after a pause. She hesitated. And be your wife. You don't owe me that, he said. You don't owe me anything. Jonah turned to mount his horse, but she stopped him with a single word. Wait. He paused. I don't want to stay in Hollow Rock, she said quietly, but I don't want to walk alone anymore. He met her gaze, and for the first time in years, she saw something in a man's eyes that didn't take. It didn't pity. It simply offered a place to rest. She stepped forward. He offered his hand, and together, they turned their backs on the town that had once called her nothing. They didn't ride far, just far enough for Hollow Rock to disappear behind them, swallowed in dust and the golden light of dusk. No destination, no plan, just two weary souls moving forward quietly, freely, without chains. They stopped at a roadside inn just beyond the ridge. A weathered sign swung in the wind, Mercy's Rest. Inside, a single lantern glowed over worn wood and empty chairs. An old woman behind the counter looked up. Her eyes were sharp at first, then softened when she saw the girl. Room's yours if you want it, the woman said. No questions. Jonah nodded, dropped some coins. They sat near the fire, not close, but not far. He ordered stew and cornbread. Simple, sufficient. She hadn't realized how long it had been since she'd eaten something warm, something whole. Maybe since before the arrest. Maybe even before the fear. She sat with her hands folded, unmoving, until the food arrived. Then, slowly, she lifted the spoon. Jonah didn't watch her. He just ate. No talk, no pressure, just quiet. When she'd eaten half the bowl, he glanced her way. Want the rest? He asked. She shook her head. No. Thank you. He pushed his bowl toward her anyway. She hesitated. Then took a bite. And in that tiny act, something passed between them. Not love. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But something real. A beginning. She set the spoon down, leaned back. The fire crackled low. You were really going to leave after the trial? She asked. Yes. Why? I didn't think you'd want a reminder of that place. She looked at him, the way the flames danced against his steady face. Maybe I don't, she said, but I want something to look forward to. Jonah didn't smile. He rarely did. But his eyes softened. What do you want? He asked. She looked at her hands, once trembling, now still. A place I can walk into without hearing whispers, she said. A name I can speak without shame. He nodded. And a table, she added. He raised a brow. A table. One where someone saves me a seat, where I don't have to earn it. Jonah reached across, not to touch her but to gently straighten the spoon that had shifted. Then we'll build that, he said. No promises, no vows, just truth. The old woman brought them tea without asking. She'd seen many travelers pass through, but few with eyes so worn and quiet. Outside, stars appeared one by one, and inside that small tavern called Mercy's Rest, a girl who once had no name sat with a man who had once been feared and felt, for the first time, like she might be seen, not as a victim, not as a burden, but as something beginning. That night, they shared a table not carved from timber but from silence, survival, and something that might one day be called love. Because sometimes, all a person needs is to hear one thing: you're not alone. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments. Have you ever felt invisible like she did? Or maybe like Jonah, you've been the one who stayed quiet, but stood strong. Subscribe to Edge of Fiction so you never miss the stories that matter. Your voice belongs here. We'll be waiting for you in the next chapter.